Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Zap the Risks at Special Events. I'm Al Heron, West Central SUMA representative, Mayor of the Town of Eston, and a SUMA Sure board member. This session is sponsored by SUMA Sure. As most of you know, SUMA Sure is the urban municipalities' liability and property insurance owned and governed by the cities, towns, and villages, offering no-cost risk management auditing, training, and solutions to our subscribers. SUMA Sure sets itself apart from traditional insurance products. Our goal is to share information between subscribers on risk management rather than operating in a silo mentality as in the past. With 195 cities, towns, and villages subscribing to the program as of today. This shared information is vital to preventing losses and managing municipal risk. That is why we put on events such as this one today. SUMA Sure's philosophy is not just to collect insurance premiums and pay claims, but rather to attempt to prevent the losses before they happen. Before we get into this afternoon's session, I want to quickly note the emergency exits and the AED locations marking is marked on page 24 and 25 of your convention handbook. We want to make sure the delegates are safe so that we can have, and please take a minute to familiarize yourself with that information. And expect to be reminded of this a few more times throughout the convention. Your safety is very important to us. Please note that this session, I can't talk here, is being audio recorded. That means if you want to ask a question, you will need to come to the microphone here, identify yourself and the municipality, and we ask that you speak clearly into the mic when asking your question. Using the mic means that everyone in the room can hear you, including our speaker, and that the question is then being recorded. Later this month, the presentations will be available on SUMA YouTube channel, and we want those recordings to be good resource for you. And so everything needs to be recorded. When we plan events for our members, we try to tailor the topics and speakers to your needs. The full bios of all our speakers are available on the event base, the convention, our convention app, where you can see the work these folks have put into gaining the knowledge they are going to share with you. Please give them your full attention and be open to how their information can apply to your municipality. Some lessons are going to be easier to apply than others, but I am sure everyone in this room can use these valuable nuggets of information when you go back to your offices. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Kevin Danneman, Vice President, General Manager of K&K Insurance Canada. Kevin has more than 15 years experience in underwriting, risk management, and sales. And K&K is a leading provider of specialty sport, leisure, and entertainment insurance. Thank you for joining us today, Kevin. Delegates, please give him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. And welcome to Zap the Wrist at Special Events. My name is Kevin Danneman, and I am the Vice President and General Manager at K&K Insurance. As Al mentioned, I've been in the industry for about 15 years now, always in commercial insurance through a variety of roles previously at Dominion of Canada Insurance, and then obviously Travelers after the purchase. So I moved over to K&K about 9 months ago. It's been a great experience for me, a wonderful company out of the U.S. and with a couple offices here in Canada, and one that I'll speak about shortly in a little bit more depth. We have just over an hour together, so I'll touch on a variety of items, and we'll go over the agenda in a second. However, your interaction is obviously key. If you have questions, by all means, come to the mic. We're happy to have a discussion on coverages or questions you may have. And of course, we have some SUMA representatives here as well. So Susan is in the back. I don't know if she can wave her hand. Yay. Kevin's in the back as well. There he is. And Rick's here as well. So those are your three contacts if you have any questions on SUMA coverage or need any further information. And I would encourage you to discuss anything you need with them after the presentation is done. So I'm here to talk about special risk events and obviously the number of things you can do to prevent. Whoops, I jumped back here. There we go. So I'm here to talk about a number of items. Most importantly, special events, the risks that are associated with them, and what you can do to minimize losses or claims on your end. I think the timing of the discussion is pretty important and key as obviously the Super Bowl is going on today. It's the largest special event in North America on an annual basis. So very timely and very interesting that we picked today of all days to have that discussion. And I know I'm standing in a room filled with Rider fans, but show of hands if anybody thinks Brady and the Patriots are going to take it again today? A couple? A few? Wow. You don't have much faith in this guy, but if you saw the game last year, I would never count Brady out until it's over. So we'll see what takes place later on for sure. So the agenda today, I'll just talk about K&K Insurance, give you a background, an overview of what we do, a bit about our history, what kind of products and coverages we can possibly offer you guys in the future for some of your events. We'll talk about waivers and contracts, animal exposures at special events, what I referred to as not so general events, fireworks displays, bouncy castles, parades, hay rides, wagon rides, snowmobile events, that kind of stuff. Definitely liquor, liability. I'm sure if you didn't indulge already last night, you're probably going to indulge tonight while you're watching the Super Bowl. So pretty timely topic on that one as well. And obviously safety is the new fun. You'll understand why I make that statement when we get to the slide later on. So there'll be time for questions at the end, but like I said, there's lots of topics to go over. But I encourage you to raise your hands or come to the mic if you have any questions throughout the presentation, just because it moves from topic to topic. On another note, if you see me drinking water, I have a 1-year-old daughter who's determined to try to get me sick, so I'm trying to fight off a cold. So I am from an insurance company, so there's your disclaimer. I had to add that in. Couldn't have a presentation without one. You know what? This is just an informational purpose slide. It's not designed to amend any coverage you have through SUMA or provide you any legal advice. Blah, blah, blah. You guys can all read it. Everybody got that. So a bit about K&K Insurance Brokers. We have been around since 1952. A bit of an interesting story, actually. They're based, K&K was based out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. I was a husband and wife. The K and the K is Krauskopf. Teddy and Nord are the two names that are on there. It was a husband and wife racing team. So they raced cars, like a lot of other people in the area did. Realized that after some accidents, that nobody had any coverage. You couldn't get insurance coverage for racing at the time. So what they did was they began collecting $1 from each of the drivers that would attend the race, and forming the first insurance policy for motorsports. Obviously, your car insurance has gone up significantly from $1, but it was a good start, and one that has them recognized in Fort Wayne as a historical, and they have a historical plaque outside of the office, outside of the head office. Outside of motorsports, which continues to be very strong for us, we expanded into sports, leisure, and entertainment. And in 1990, K&K opened in Canada, where we continue to operate today with offices in Toronto and Vancouver. Fort Wayne, Indiana remains home, the head office for K&K, and we're now over $400 million in size for revenue, with over 300 employees across North America. And unlike other large insurance companies, the Intacs or the Avivas of the world, we've remained focused on specialty insurance and have over 70 classes of business that we write, but remain in that sports, leisure, entertainment space. We don't write any personal or general commercial insurance. So as I mentioned before to Susan, if you have any questions about homeowners insurance, I am not the person you should be speaking to. Okay, so just on the screen now are some classes of business that we write here in Canada. It may be hard to see, so I'll just touch on a few that are back there. Again, sports, leisure, entertainment is the space we write insurance for. That includes, go-kart tracks, fairs and festivals, camps, casinos, zip lining, just to name a few. Some big differences between, again, K&K and some of the general markets is we try to provide specific coverage tailored to these events. So one of the things we offer is a free waiver. We'll talk about waivers in a few minutes, but upon binding insurance with a K&K policy, you will get a legally tested waiver to use, which obviously for some clients like yourselves, it can save you a lot of money. You don't have to go to a lawyer, get one drafted, and then wonder if it's going to hold up in court. Ours are legally tested in Canada and have stood up in court as well. In addition to that, we have something just to point out that's interesting on that slide is adverse weather. It's the top of the second column there. And what this is, and it's becoming more of a coverage of providing on a regular basis, and one that may be of very interest to you, is that it provides weather-related, essentially business interruption coverage. So for weather-related losses. So we've seen a big uptake on this recently over the last year or so, and it really hits home with the smaller outdoor type events. So say you have a 3-day, jazz fest or rib fest or some festival going on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Your biggest revenue generating time is Saturday afternoons. That's when most people come out, and maybe that's when the beer sales are the highest. And you worry that, a rain event could come in and wipe out your entire revenue for the event. Maybe you're a nonprofit and that is your annual source of revenue. We would provide coverage for a specific time period, so from 2 to 5 p.m., let's say on the Saturday, for specific amount of rain that you decide you want to cover for. So what we use is we use a Doppler system that's pinpointed to the event itself. And let's say you thought, 2 millimeters of rain from 2 to 5, people will still come out, the event will still go on, but anything over 10 or 15 millimeters and you'll have to shut it down, or most people won't come out and you'll lose a significant source of your revenue. And we would provide specific coverage for that time period and that rain amount. And if there was a claim and the rain did occur, you'd be reimbursed fully for the revenue that you're missing out on. So it's important to know that that coverage is out there, just because, it ranges in price, from a couple $100s to a few $1,000s, depending on your revenue, the size. But as an example, we have a guy in Northern Ontario who does tractor pulls. For the last 10 years, he's bought the coverage. Luckily, it's never had a claim. But by all means, that tractor pull in that community is the event of the year. And he is more concerned about, missing out on revenue for an entire year than paying a couple $100s for the coverage. So he knows his revenue is guaranteed no matter what happens with the weather. The only catch on that one is, just in case you're wondering, it does have to be requested at least 14 days before the event. So you can't go onto the weather network and see there's a giant rainstorm coming and then think, oh, I really should get that coverage. But definitely, if you want to speak about this coverage or others, like we have non-appearance as well. If the band you're having a concert doesn't get on the plane, or the entire event has to be canceled, we have coverage for that as well. So not necessarily a coverage for everyone, but certainly if you're really worried about the revenue you're generating on a weekend event, we'd be happy to discuss it further in terms of providing the coverage. Just while we're on the page as well, some interesting risks that K&K has written over the past couple of years. And if you think your town has, or city or community has interesting risks, believe me, we've probably seen it. Anyone interested in U.S. politics will be interested to know that we wrote the Trump and Clinton presidential campaigns. Every event that Trump and Clinton put on, we had coverage for. And we also wrote the Republican National Convention in Ohio, I believe it was, when that took place. So I had a dedicated person in the U.S. who scrambled to catch up with Trump's movements, all the festivals and events that he ran on a regular basis and continue to this day. In the past, we've written the Super Bowl, which is obviously timely given today's Super Bowl is occurring. Fortunately, we didn't get it this year, but we've had it in years past. And we write a good portion of the NHL account here in the US and Canada. A little closer to home, we write a portion of the CFL accounts. We write an excess policy for the CFL. So please do not slip at Mosaic Stadium. Otherwise, I will be out of bonus next year. But beautiful stadium, by the way. I just drove by it for the first time. And we remain, a big participant in Canadian motorsports. We provide insurance for the Formula One race in Montreal and the Honda Indy in Toronto. So we're very much ingrained in the communities and towns, whether it's large events or whether it's, like I said, small one-day festivals. And our slogan is, we ensure the world's fun. We enjoy what we do. And hopefully we can meet some of your needs moving forward if you need the coverages. So before I get to the next slide, we're just going to touch on waivers. So can I show of hands in terms of who thinks that waivers don't hold up in court? A couple? Most people? Why would you think that? I guess most of the time they're long and boring and nobody reads them, and why would it hold up, right? That's starting to change, and I'll get to reasons why in a minute. So most people, despite the hands in this room, most people believe they don't hold up in court, and that's actually not entirely true. So what I did was I attached an article, and you can link to this as well. It's from Vancouver. It was at a Whistler claim that was in 2009. However, the case just ended in 2017, so it's pretty relevant in terms of our discussions here. So what it was is just going to go through a synopsis because the live link isn't working properly right now. But there was a man mountain biking and ended up with a spinal cord injury, which put him permanently in a wheelchair. Obviously, a sad situation, not one we'd like to see. But we'll discuss it from a waiver point of view and go from there. So Jameson was the man. He was a competent rider, capable of hitting double black diamond trails. And for 3 years, he'd been a volunteer patroller at the bike park before he took what was called the A-Line Trail in 2009. It was a trail the biker knew, and it was classified as a single black diamond, so definitely well within his scope. A run of that designation was described by the resort as having a mixture of long, steep descents, loose trail surfaces, numerous natural and man-made obstacles, including jumps, ramps, elevated features, berms, drops, rocks, and other terrain variations. About 2/3 down the way, there's a rock drop, and you can probably picture it. It's about a granite slab angled about 45 degrees, and riders can either choose to take the drop or go around it. Needless to say, by his injuries, you can probably tell that he took it, and he went for it himself. So before the biker used the park, he signed a 4-page agreement that waived claims against the resorts and released it from liability for any loss, damage, expense, or injury, including death. He, of course, later claimed that he was rushed through the signature process because there was a lineup of people. He said he didn't know he had signed a waiver, and nothing in the ticket alerted him that the park carried a high risk of serious injury. He also has also had his part-time patroller led him to believe the risk was minimal. His exact quote was, "I had no idea that a spinal cord injury was possible, and specifically that going over the handlebars was a common mechanism of injury." But that's exactly what happened. The park patroller, when he found him, figured that he did go over the handlebars, and he said Jamieson told him he tried to pre-jump that granite slab drop, which is an expert maneuver used to shave to run off time. If you can picture him going towards that slab runoff, he tried to jump over it without going down it and caught the lip of the drop with his rear tire, and that catapulted him over the handlebars. In her ruling, the justice noted that the warnings of the risk were reasonable and that someone who signed the resort's release would understand that they were waiving the right to sue, she found, and specifically commented, "The release is comprehensive, clear, and blunt. I do not see how any adult with basic reading skills could reasonably believe he or she has the right to sue Whistler if they were injured in the park, even if Whistler was negligent." So it was a very interesting case and one that's going to set precedents moving forward. The reason why I say that there's some factors that everybody should be aware of, as not all waivers are created equally, is that not everyone will stand up. But in this case, it did. So some of the key factors you just want to pay attention to if you're not using a waiver that we have provided from K&K is that there's a length and format of the waiver that has to be in place. In this case, yes, it was 4 pages. But if you're an iPhone user, it was not one of those ones where you just sort of scrolled down all the way to the bottom and then checked, I agree, and then moved on. It was one that had multiple points and positions on the page requiring initials and signatures. And beside those initials and signatures were some key warnings outlined in a red box, and they were also bold lettering. The format had changed around those signatures. So clearly, the Jamieson, obviously an unfortunate injury, but had to have read through the waiver, had to have signed it in multiple different spots, and it was clearly written in a language that he understood, especially given that he was a professional, not a professional, but a bike enthusiast who'd been on trails in the past. So as noted there, the time available to review the waiver, again, if there had been some perception that he was rushed through the process, it again may not have held up. And really the difference between signed and unsigned documents. So the signature is really key. Like I said, multiple signature places are even better. You could still get an unsigned waiver to hold up in court, but you must prove that the alleged party was aware or ought to have been aware of the terms and conditions. So it gets a lot more gray when you talk about that space. Just like I mentioned at the bottom, different waivers for obviously different audiences. Commercial contracts versus unsophisticated individuals. Language must differ in either scenario. So it really has to be written to the audience that you want to sign the waiver. It can't be written, in full legal terms and then given to the general public. They just won't understand what they're writing. So it really has to be geared to the right audience. In this case, it was well written. This was not a K&K loss, by the way. It happened to be just one we came across, but one that was written properly with the right amount of language and signatures used. Anybody have any questions on waivers? Stop there for a second. Okay. Sorry?
You used the word entirety at the start.
Mm-hmm.
Would you come to the mic, please?
Gets you to stretch while we talk for an hour anyways.
Jim Winiger from the town of Dalmany. At the start of your conversation regarding waivers, you said entirely isn't true.
Mm-hmm.
What did you mean by the word entirely?
Well, it's just there was a perception that it doesn't hold up in court. There's obviously two different views, and there remains two different views on whether it will or will not. So the statement around that it won't hold up isn't entirely true, in that there is now a precedent set with this case, and there has been others in the past where it's changing that stance within the court system itself. This is obviously a high-profile case, but it really is starting to come around where you need to know what you, as the general public, would be signing, because you have to understand that there's risk associated with some of the activities you take place, and vice versa if you're putting the events on in your community. You know what, it has to be written in a way that will hold up in court. So there's no necessarily right or wrong or true or false in this section. It really depends on the activity, the events, and who the waiver is catered to. Susan?
What about minors?
Minors are, yes, that's a good question. So minors are very difficult in that it tends to not hold up in court. I have more confidence in this waiver where it was an adult who knew the situation he was getting himself into. With children, although the parents essentially signing away that right to sue, we don't have as much confidence that holds up. It is certainly better than not having anything in place. But I guess if you're trying to do a wins versus losses, I would say the losses are still higher than the wins in terms of a waiver standing up. But it's definitely moving in the direction of holding longer term as the waivers get more comprehensive and as they're geared towards the people that are writing them. So you know what, that 3-page paper where you just agree at the end, it won't hold up for children. It probably won't hold up for adults either. But if it's written to the audience, there's a better chance of it moving forward. And the courts are starting to realize that if you're taking undue risk, like this guy was, in terms of not only taking a steep descent, but trying to do an expert maneuver off of it, you shouldn't have the right to necessarily sue Whistler for an activity they're trying to provide to the general public. Otherwise, the risk is that we just won't have these events moving forward, and in a lot of cases, that would be a real shame. Go ahead.
Yeah, Kevin Madden from SUMA. Just a comment really is when these waivers, the tendency is to try and do it yourself, make it simple, just drop something on your own Word document and everything else like that. We always recommend don't do that. Don't just grab a waiver off of Google or something like that. Get it reviewed by your legal counsel or talk to a lawyer, because they need to know, or they can advise you the right legal elements that should be in that contract to help get ahead of these situations where it will hold up or won't hold up. So just a comment from my
Yeah, no, that's great advice too, because I mean, this is not when a waiver goes to court, we're not talking about $10,000 in terms of claims. As in this case, thank you very much. He is paralyzed for life. There are family commitments and work issues that he obviously has to struggle through. And as the community or as the company putting on these events, you could be sued for millions. It's not to say we won't provide coverage where coverage is due, because that's the intent of insurance. But in this case specifically, as the example, you know what, this is where a company needs to protect itself, or a community organization needs to protect itself before going down a road of having multi-million-dollar lawsuits. Any other questions on waivers? Okay. So just going through some facility contracts and rental agreements. Similar to waivers, the contracts and rental agreements outline the responsibilities of each party. These are legally binding agreements, so it's important to have them reviewed, as Kevin said, by a lawyer, or at minimum, a SUMA representative can help you review the contract, the rental agreement. Often what you'll find is if you're the one signing the contract, not the one who's if you're the one renting the venue, the company who's renting it to you usually throws in way more coverage request than is required, often higher limits than most people carry under their commercial liability policy. And it's really almost impossible to go back to that rental company once it's already signed. So yes, they will always come to you if you're renting something with their the best ask that they have. They're going to ask you for everything. A lot of that is not required, and if you sign the rental agreement or the contract before reviewing your insurance with a SUMA rep, you may be required to purchase additional insurance to meet the needs of that contract, which is what we don't want you to do. So, you know what, if you usually carry $2 million in CGL coverage, some rental agreements require $5 million, some require $10 million. Of course, that can be negotiated before you sign the rental, but afterwards, if you've already signed it, it puts us as insurance companies in a bit of a bind in that we may not be able to provide that free of charge and could cost you a little bit of money in the end. So just note that, it doesn't always happen, but just note that, yeah, they tend to shoot for the stars with these rental agreements and contracts in terms of coverage. So get some legal advice before you sign anything. The the rental company or the facility has spent the time with their lawyers to draft something. You should spend just as much time reviewing it on your end as a strong recommendation. So each contract should note, obviously, the time of use and the event that has been discussed or agreed upon. Be specific. If you're the one renting it out to somebody from your community, your facility, make sure that it's specific in terms of what would take place there. And if something changes somewhere along the way before the event starts, make sure it's amended into the contract. You want to be very specific in terms of what you're either renting the space for or what you're renting the space out to do. It's obviously in your best interest, and make sure the responsibilities of each party, coverages that I just noted, are clearly outlined. But one of the biggest things out there is make sure that you've discussed some handback procedures. Often people think of the event itself taking place and don't really think about how the venue is going to be handed back to the owner after it's done. And certainly as we get into a conversation about animals, there is a cleanup involved. It may require, next day cleanup or something, a little more detailed than just sort of sweeping the floors. So you want to make sure that if you're renting something out to your community, that it comes back to you exactly how you rented it out, and vice versa if you're renting it from somebody else. So make sure that that agreement is in, that part of the agreement is in the contract. Just a couple of the things to note as well. There's a hold harmless agreement. Make sure it's reciprocal. Oftentimes, if you are the one renting a facility, there's usually a hold harmless against you, in that you cannot go back and subrogate against the building owner that you've rented from. They do this very often. We see this on a regular basis, and you really don't want to get into a contract that doesn't go both ways. The venue owner should be responsible for, the facility itself. You should be responsible for the event that you put on at the venue, and if there's a loss from their point of view, it should be them that covers and picks it up. So make sure there's nothing in there, no language in there that states that you are responsible, and the words hold harmless will be in there. You are holding them harmless in the event that something takes place, because then anything that occurs during that event, even if it's the responsibility or the fault of the building owner, it will fall back on you. Oftentimes we see waiver of subrogation. This is pretty standard. Usually government lands, government asks you to waive your right to subrogate. It's essentially another version of the hold harmless. That is not the end of the world. We've seen that before, and we're fairly comfortable in that space. Just making sure, again, like the hold harmless, if you're waiving your right to subrogate, that you know the exposure is there, and that's really where your SUMA Sure rep can help out and discuss the risks you're willing to take on. There may be risks you're comfortable with, and that's totally fine, but make sure you have that discussion before, again, signing any rental agreements or contracts. And additional insurers, just a note there, why are we adding them? Do they have their own insurance coverage? If they're asking you to be added to your policy as additional insured, they must have their own insurance coverage. They must have a certificate of insurance to provide to you. Then your exposure is minimized, because if they do anything wrong, the claim would fall under their policy. If they don't have any insurance and they get added as an additional insured to your policy, then you are picking up all of their operations and their exposure, which we do not want. Susan's shaking her head repeatedly in the back. No, so I would agree. Making sure that if they do get added, that they have their own coverage and they've shown that to you with a certificate. So nothing, you know what, that stands out as overly concerning in this section, but just be aware of who you're renting from, be aware of what kind of contract you're getting into, and by all means, get it reviewed before you sign anything. Again, they've spent the time to draft it with their lawyers. You should take the time to make sure they're protected as well. Any questions on rental agreements or contracts? No? Okay. So moving on to a little bit lighter topics, some animal activities at events. I mean, obviously animals, very popular, kids love them, you know, adults, we love them. Anyone who doesn't live on or near a farm gets to experience, you know, farm animals and some wildlife, and it makes a great part of any event. So certainly we're not saying not to have any animals because they are a lot of fun, but just be aware of some of the issues. Good, you know, loss control, loss prevention measures can reduce the occurrence of negative incidents and protect you and your operation from claims that arise even when you've done everything within reason to prevent yourself. That's what we're here for, we're insurance. We provide coverage when claims occur, but you're just trying to minimize the risk that can take place. So when you have animals at events, make sure you know what is the age of the demographic of patrons attending. You know, is it kids, is it the elderly, is it a mixture of everybody? What type of animals will be there? Is it going to be small, docile animals, large animals? Each one of them presents different risk exposures. And what is the separation between the animals and the attendees? Is it fencing? Is it a wall? Is it open to touch? Because depending on the interaction type, the risk obviously significantly increases the closer you allow patrons to attend and the more they can actually touch the animals. Also, if you're having larger animals, even though they're docile, they may step back accidentally, hit somebody, knock somebody over. These are all claims that can occur, and certainly bacteria or germs passing from the animal to the kids or to the adults should be a consideration. So again, not saying not to have animals, but just be aware of the fact that these kind of things can occur. And certainly what you don't want to do is, you know, have a kid get sick, go after he goes home due to bacteria issues, and then go to school the next day, spread that to 6 other kids at the school, and all of a sudden you have a larger claim. Just be aware of how that can affect you. And then just an important point at the end, you know, who's watching the animals and who's watching the attendees. Sometimes the attendees are more dangerous than the animals. You know, tend to get too close, tend to provoke the animals, tend to feed the animals. So make sure you're having somebody sort of watch both, because sometimes, like I said, the animals are the least of the issue when you're having animals at events. So just continuing on with that point, ensure the animals have a clean bill of health. The farm supplying the animals has its own insurance. Most special events do not cover animals, livestock. I would assume that Susan and Kevin agree that there's no coverage for the livestock. So that's fine. You don't need to worry about the animals necessarily themselves, but you have to make sure that they're not coming in with any health-related issues that can be spread to the patrons that are attending. We certainly recommend no food or drink in the animal area, as it can affect obviously both the animals and the attendees, as I just mentioned. Baby strollers are not recommended as they're bulky and can get in the way, as well as pick up bacteria. And that's what a lot of people, again, don't realize, is that your clothing, the baby strollers, anything that goes into the animal exposure area can come back out with bacteria, and that can lead to a larger scale issue, especially if they go home and then get sick after the event ends, which happens to occur on a lot of the claims that we see. We recommend, obviously, that no one touch the animals. You know, I get that it's not always possible. It's not always the most fun if they can't pet the animals, but we recommend it. And you know what, as I mentioned, that's usually where the issues come from afterwards, in that the event is long over and people get sick and then spread it around, and you're ultimately on the hook for that. Because remember, the farm company supplying the animals is only covering the animals themselves. Okay. Any questions on animals? Anybody experience any animal issues at their community events? No? Everybody's been good? That's great. Okay. So I'm just going to move on to what I'm referring to as not so general events, and the first one will be parades. I refer to as not so general because people tend to go to these on an annual basis. Every community or town has a parade of some sort, whether it's a Christmas parade or whether it's something else for Canada Day. But the tendency is to just not pay attention to detail in terms of the exposures that change from year to year. And I'll touch on that in a minute. But really, don't take for granted the exposures that come with parades that you put up in your town or community. Some important items to review, obviously the following. How does the parade affect typical emergency response services? If your emergency response cannot get down the main street because that's where the parade's occurring, how does it affect secondary roads, stop signs, closed roads? If it's going to take an enormous amount of time to get to somebody who's sick 3/4 of the way down or has an issue 3/4 of the way down the parade route, it would make much more sense to have somebody, EMT, stationed there than to try to get through crowds or blocked roads to get there in the first place, because injuries happen. You just want to be protecting yourself in the event that something does. Obviously, because the roads are required to be shut down, plan well in advance. I know this SUMA convention has been planned well in advance as well. You have to take the time to detail perimeter, detail plans, make sure that you involve everybody, including the local police for security. These are on, municipal or town roads. There's going to be shutdowns. There could be issues in terms of crime or anything else like that. And it really goes beyond a simple security patrol and should involve your local police if possible. And the plus side is it obviously gets your local police involved in the community itself, which is a bonus for everyone. We have a note in there just to establish a minimum age for walking participants. As I noted at the start, I have a 1-year-old who's trying to get me sick. I certainly would not want her walking down the parade route. It would take 4 hours to get through the parade. She'd probably sit down halfway through, and the whole parade would have to come to a stop. So by all means, make sure you have a minimum age for walking participants. And on that note, maybe a maximum age as well, just to make sure that everybody's fit and can keep the parade route itself moving. And I have a note on here, just, it's established standards for costumes. There's a risk of bad publicity. That's really becoming one where I say that exposures change from year to year. Your community parade, your local parade is really not local anymore. You're part of the global community. Whether you are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and the others that are out there, your parade is now on there. The patrons attending your parade are sharing pictures, videos of your parade online. And you can really use this to your advantage. A clever hashtag or a clever promotion on the parade route itself, or something that people can follow, can really get significantly further reach than ever before, can put your town, your community on the map, can drive tourism into your area. And really, you need to be aware of that. As a side note, I attend a number of conventions throughout the country, and I take a picture, obviously, of the booth. I took a picture of the setup here today, and I'll put it on my LinkedIn page, part of some of the work that I'm doing. My LinkedIn page will generate about 2,000 to 3,000 views of the picture of the booth, or of me in the booth itself. And that obviously significantly outperforms the actual attendees that are at the convention. So when you start thinking of, how can I use the event, obviously to interact with people, interacting with people is what I enjoy doing. But as a secondary and a beneficial, for brand awareness, or in your case, community or town awareness, use that to your advantage, because the views online will probably get more views than the people actually attending. On the flip side of that, you obviously have to be careful regarding the costumes, and make sure you reviewed all the float ideas in your parade. Even if the parade is sponsored by, the local Ford dealership or some local community associations, if you're the one who's you're the organizer, you have to make sure that you're ultimately responsible for what goes down that parade route. And keeping that global community in mind is really something that needs to be considered. Everybody knows, the Me Too movements, the Black Lives Matter movements, the gay and lesbian rights movements. There's, new things coming up every day. You really have to gear your parade, your costumes, your event to make sure it doesn't infringe on anybody's rights or prejudices in order to keep yourself as a viable, growing, positive community in the global stage. Because again, these things get picked up really quickly, and you don't want to become something that's trending on Twitter. Along that same line, we just don't recommend tossing anything into the crowd. I know it's very tempting to, throw some candies in there for the kids, or, throw some giveaways out into the crowd. You can still do that, but again, keep in mind that there's an audience out there that likely grows larger than the people watching. And if you want to provide handouts, you should have somebody walking beside the floats, hand them out to the patrons attending. It's a lot more of an interaction point rather than just throwing something there. And then that way I'll never come across a YouTube video of somebody getting hit in the head at one of your Saskatchewan parades. So believe me, they're out there if you search on YouTube. So not saying don't do it, but just be mindful that obviously it can cause injury to the person if they're not paying attention, if they get hit with something. But more importantly, it can actually cause you further damage by trending online and causing further issues down the line. So not to scare anybody, but just be aware that what you do out there is being watched by a lot more than just the people in your community. So along those same lines, prohibit alcoholic beverages along the crowd route if you can. Obviously, we'll get into liquor exposure shortly, but if you're allowing liquor, you're ultimately on the hook for that event. From an insurance loss point of view, you want to protect yourself from that. Floats, certainly if there's movement, dancing on the float, there should be side barriers to avoid falling from the float, especially if you already allowed alcohol, then you're definitely going to fall off the float, so make sure there's some guards there. And also should be required, obviously, if children are on the float, you want to be careful with them as well. Anything that's moving, you want to be very careful. So maintain a distance between those in the parade and the crowd. I have a note here just saying dangerous people going into the crowd and dragging someone out to dance. A lot of fun, but certainly you don't want to see me get dragged out to dance with anybody. And it can cause a loss if I trip over my own feet and fall while I'm on the parade route. So avoid it if you can. Certainly it's going to happen from time to time, but it really allow the people watching the parade to watch and allow the people to be in the parade to do what they're there to do, and that's entertain the crowd. And just a note as well, animals in the parade, horses, etc., that whole cleanup piece that I mentioned in the contractual recommendations. If you're having animals in the parades, make sure that your agreement with the town, or if somebody's conducting a parade with you as the town, that you have an agreement in there on cleanup, when it gets done and by who, so that there's a final walkthrough after the parade is done and everything's up to your satisfaction. Questions on parades? Okay. Just moving on to some hay rides, wagon rides. Obviously everybody enjoys them. Tractor, horse-drawn hay rides usually stop during the course of the ride for a variety of reasons. If somebody walks in front of it, they have to cross a secondary road. But guests could obviously exit prematurely and injuries could occur. Caution must be advised to all riders to not exit until advised. It's usually where you see your losses from an insurance point of view or claim, is that somebody thinks the ride is over, they jump out, or they're about to jump out, and the ride starts moving again, and then they fall, obviously, and injure themselves. Consider adding a chain or a rope across the wagon entrance exit, just to again advise people when they should or shouldn't move. Drivers should look back to ensure the guests are seated prior to starting the ride. Obviously, ideal situations, you have a driver driving and a secondary person watching the patrons in the back. But failing that, just consider a rearview mirror to watch the guests to make sure they're not doing anything that would cause them issue or get injured. And obviously, smoking or consumption of alcohol should be prohibited, especially if you're the one driving the tractor. There you go. So next one is just talking about fireworks displays. And again, we're moving through topics to stay on task, but if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me. I'm happy to answer anything you have. So fireworks displays, this is actually directly from a SUMA June 2017 bulletin. It was called Are Fireworks Covered? I thought it was a great reference point for you all to review. It followed Kincaids guidelines to a T, so we definitely recommend that you review that bulletin if you haven't. And obviously keep an eye out for future bulletins that SUMA provides to its members. So we'll do a before, during, and after in terms of the fireworks displays, and we'll just touch on the before first, obviously. Pyrotechnician, obviously that is your recommended point. The professional fireworks display operator who's gone through training programs, received certification in putting on fireworks. These obviously individuals can help you design a display of fireworks, but more importantly, they know what to do to keep the public safe. Now, in understanding, in talking with your SUMA reps, obviously that's not always possible. So secondary would be the fire department. They wouldn't necessarily have the training in terms of how to put on necessarily a technical display, but they do understand obviously keeping the community safe and keeping patrons safe. So first, pyrotechnician, that's the way to go. They usually have their own insurance as well. So again, your event would be covered off by their exposure. But secondary, if you had to go to fire department, that would be your second best option. There really shouldn't be a third best option. You don't want Kevin back there setting off fireworks to your display. He might let off a few, but then who knows what happens after that. So it is a dangerous profession, one that when done right, it certainly looks good and everybody enjoys, but there has to be the right precautions put in place to do that. So you really should be mapping your site. The site must include adequate open space. The fallout area should be free of spectators, vehicles, combustible materials, and overhead objects. Depending on your community, your town, you certainly do not want a fire starting as a result of fireworks that come down. So just as a reference point, again, this is from the SUMA Bulletin, the minimum distance from launch area to the spectators should be a radius of at least 70 feet per inch of the internal diameter of the largest mortar. So if you're looking at your largest mortar, we don't really care how many there are, but look at the largest one. If the largest mortar is 6 inches in diameter, the crowd should be back at least 420 feet. If you kind of use that math in terms of your own pyrotechnics, you'll probably be pretty safe in terms of keeping people back as far as they need to be. So during the event, obviously emergency plans, emergency services should be on site. If you're using the fire department to set off the fireworks, make sure that you have other resources to take care of the people attending if there's any issues, and to watch the perimeters. If possible, obviously have your police, EMT at the event to handle any emergencies. Most of the time, if you're using the right distances and you're taking the right precautions, nothing should happen. But in the event that something does, you want to make sure you're protected as well. So have spotters, and the spotter should be constantly monitoring the show. The pyrotechnician or the fireworks department, whoever's setting it off, is likely just paying attention to the next firework going off, not where they're landing, where they're exploding, if there's any directional changes in wind. And that really, can be the biggest issue for you when setting off fireworks displays, is that all your planning can go into, best intentions. But if the wind changes at the last minute or becomes too strong, you have to have a decision ready in terms of what wind speed you'll cancel the fireworks. Because these can really cause fires and a lot of issues if the sparks from the firework lands on something that's combustible. So just be prepared to cancel and change your plans if needed. And know where that line is in the sand where you're planning. Know what the maximum kilometer-an-hour wind should be. So assuming everything went fine, obviously during the fireworks display, you want to do an after check, perform site inspections, check the fallout area. A lot of times we have unexploded shells, other debris that comes down. You obviously don't want the general public to go out and find these and get injured as a result. Complete incident reports. I can't stress how important that is. If something does happen, report them to your SUMA rep immediately. Fill out an incident report when it actually happens. People's memories tend to get fuzzy after 2 or 3 weeks, or 2 or 3 months, depending on when a claim comes in. Because it may not come in right away, and you're really not opening a claim by providing an incident report. You're just advising that something occurred, and that if a claim does come forward or somebody does sue going forward because of an injury, you have accurate detail at the time it took place, which is really key in terms of defending yourselves from any suits or claims that come forward. So just be aware of that. Again, it was a really great bulletin that I saw out there. So for the display fireworks, by all means put them on, but use adequate spacing, keep people protected. So snowmobile events. Everybody loves, it's definitely this time of year. Snowmobile events, and I'll touch on mud bogs as well with ATVs at the end of it. So waiver requirement, again, we talked about that at the beginning. There's differences between adults and minors. There's different forms. Again, the form should be geared to the person that's signing it in language that they understand with multiple signature points. There should be an EMT staffed ambulance on site. At K&K, we won't write any snowmobile races or events where there is no EMT. Staffed mobile fire equipment on premises. You may be out on a lake, you're maybe out in the distance, and there's just no roads or sufficient access for a fire department to get in if one of the snowmobiles catches fire or some issue happens. So you want to have some mobile equipment out with you. We certainly at K&K recommend there's no berms at snowmobile events to avoid the possibility of launching into the crowd. Again, best intention, you try to keep the crowd safe. You build a berm, the snowmobile loses control, goes over the berm, and launches airborne into the crowd. Again, it has happened in the past, so we want to make sure we're careful. So what we recommend is for snowmobiles, 2 positive barriers, a minimum 4 feet high, one at 80 feet and the other at 100 feet to contain the crowd. So the one that's 80 feet away would sort of catch the snowmobile, or at least prevent it from going directly into the crowd. And the 20-foot space would allow a gap for that to slow down. And then at 100 feet, it would contain the crowd at that point. Obviously, depending on your situation, your footage in terms of how far you keep the crowd back would differ, but that as a recommendation is what we would recommend. And if you're looking at a snowmobile race itself, if you think track-wise, the crowd should be on what is we consider a V, where the crowd is closest to the snowmobiles at the start of the race and gets significantly further out as the race goes down. And that's because, again, they're building speed. If they caught something in the snow or the ice, took a hard left or right, you want the crowd to be further back because they're at full speed when they're going down. And just as a recommendation for us as well, is we won't write a race that doesn't have a slowdown area that's twice the area of the race itself. So if the snowmobile race is 500 meters long, we require 1,000 meters runoff at the end to slow down. Just something to consider as well, because again, they're at full speed when they hit the end of the track, so they need time to slow down, and it is something we do with vehicles as well. So minimum ice depth is 2 feet on a lake surface and 3 feet on running water. Review the track area again for runoff areas, and like I said, runoff areas must be double the length of the racing surface. I don't know anybody who's racing snowmobiles without helmets, but please don't allow that. Helmets are absolutely mandatory. And snowmobiles should be raced in accordance to their powers, so racers, drivers under the age of 16 should be restricted to the lower CC machines. make sure that nobody's driving anything that they can't handle, for sure. Just on a note for mud bogs, which usual equipment is ATVing. Same fencing, same runoff, helmets, fires, ETM, 4-point harness should be required in this case. And if running side-by-sides events, then a barrier should be between the participants. Not necessarily the same case for snowmobiles, but for ATVs, there should be some sort of barrier or fencing between the two participants if they're going straight down the track. Any questions on snowmobiles? Kevin's got one.
Again, Kevin from SUMA. Just something that everybody should know is it doesn't matter what insurance policy you have, they exclude racing events. So for anybody that's having snowmobile derbies or anything else like that where there's going to be high speeds, you have to notify your broker because you're not going to be covered. I can almost guarantee that you won't have coverage automatically. You'll have to go to a company like K&K through your broker to set up that policy for these types of events. Doesn't matter if it's motorsports, snowmobiles, boating for anybody that's on resort properties, things like that. So just a comment on that.
Thanks. Yeah, and by all means, if you've never run a snowmobile track event or snowmobile event race yourself, that's what we're here for. K&K, this is what we do. Through your broker, through your local broker, or your SUMA rep, we'd be happy to guide you in terms of what needs to be in place to make sure you're protecting the patrons and the racers themselves. So that's definitely not a problem. So the next one I have is bouncy castles. Obviously, again, I'd say not so general because you see them all the time, but they're really risky. Not to say we don't write them, because we certainly do. But there's things to consider when working at bouncy castles. So I was reading a CNN article a few weeks ago, and it talked about how the higher insurance costs have forced out smaller operators. And that is actually a good thing in this space. What you do not want is somebody who has one or two bouncy castles starting an operation just to earn a few bucks. The care and operation of that bouncy castle is significantly underappreciated, I guess, in terms of what can happen if you don't have a company that's been around for a number of years and can put these on. Newer operators, it noted, tended to use 4 to 5 inch plastic stakes to hold the bouncy castles down. Professional companies use 30-inch metal ones. So there's a significant difference between who's holding the bounce castle down and who isn't. And the 3 W's they make you aware of, I guess, would be weather, workers, and warranty. Weather is your number one enemy. So I don't know if you guys have seen the bouncy castles take off in midair with kids inside of it, a couple hundred feet, injuries and death. A lot of YouTube videos of that recently over the last couple of years. Certainly, as somebody with a kid, that is the worst case scenario, not something we want to see. So use the company that's been around, who understands the exposures, who uses, the 30-inch metal clips instead of the 4 to 5 inch plastic stakes. Just another side note on this one. Most parents, everybody can be guilty of it, tend to see an inflatable bouncy castle, drop their kids off, go grab a drink, talk to their friends, and then wander back at some point to see how the kids are doing. Just the inflatable shouldn't be a babysitter in any way. Treat it as a carnival ride. If nobody's watching the carnival ride, I'm sure you wouldn't let your kids go on it as well. This would be the same. You should have multiple people. If you're the one putting on the event, multiple people should be supervising. And they should know what to look for in terms of any issues that may come up. There should be, as well, we require a minimum and maximum age. And our application notes the maximum age is 13. So it shouldn't be used for anybody under the age of 13 unless it's specifically designed for that exposure. What you have is, a 13-year-old and a 4-year-old in there. There's obviously a significant weight difference. And then the 13-year-old lands on the 4-year-old, and then there's a claim. So know the minimum, and the same thing, you wouldn't want a 1 or 2-year-old necessarily in there unless that was the entire patrons that were attending. If they're all 1 or 2 and they're all 1 or 2 in there, then you're probably fine. But when you get a varying age group, really be aware that the biggest injuries result from the kids actually hitting or landing on each other. So be aware of that for sure. So just a few more things on bouncy castles, because they are, again, very popular and something that we want you to continue to provide, but just be careful about it. Selecting, devices from providers, like I noted, that take reasonable steps in testing to ensure their safety of their products, including all applicable safety standards and practices are being adhered to. You want to comply with the manufacturer's specifications for products or components being used. If they say that it should be a 30-inch metal stake holding it down, that's what it should be in terms of installing it. Make sure the employees and customers receive appropriate written instructions relating to their jobs. Don't just have, for good intentions, the 14-year-old kid that wants to just watch the bouncy castle but doesn't really know what to look for. Provide some training in terms of what should or shouldn't happen in the bouncy castle itself. Demanding professional setup and takedown of the rental units. You shouldn't be, as the organizer, shouldn't be the one putting it up and taking it down. Reputable companies will come and install it. Make sure it's to code, make sure all the applicable standards are met, and then they will come back after the end of it and take it down. If you don't have somebody in your area that does that, you should try to find somebody who can, or make sure you're well versed in how to do it yourself. But we don't recommend that. Using rental contracts, again, waiver of liability forms. You want to make sure that if you're signing a contract, again, with the rental company for the bouncy castle, that you are protected. This is, again, where you do not want to see a hold harmless against yourself, because if they install it incorrectly and there's a loss resulting from that, they should have to pay, not yourselves. So that's where, again, you want to review the rental contract and the liability forms to make sure that you're on the hook for your exposure, which is what happens during the event, not as a result of something the installer or the rental company has provided. So maintaining consistent quality control over the things you're obviously responsible for. Document in the process. Keep all documentation and notes for the period determined by the statute of limitations in your province. I'm not sure what Saskatchewan is. Ontario is 2 years, so a claim can come in to almost 2 years after the event took place. So you want to make sure that anything that did happen, again, incident reports should be kept, and a log should be kept of when it was set up, when it was taken down, anything that occurred during it, just to keep everybody safe, because these claims tend to come in well after the event is done, where one of the kids, breaks a leg or injures themselves and goes to the doctor, and then just doesn't get better, and then 6 months later they can't join winter hockey, and then, then a suit comes forward after they meet with a lawyer, and all of a sudden it's winter, and you're trying to remember what took place the prior summer. It makes it difficult, so keep documentation. And just knowing the standards and licensing requirements for the industry, obviously, is important. Any questions on bouncy castles? No? Okay. So we will move on to liquor, which I'm sure many of you are probably looking forward to having after this is all over and watching the Super Bowl. A lot of, everybody likes to have a drink here or there, and definitely not saying not to do that. But just sort of things to be aware of if you are putting on an event in your town or your community where you are the host. There's some responsibility, and there's growing responsibility for you to be cautious about liquor moving forward. So be familiar with the term, commercial host liability. What does it mean? The term commercial host liability refers to the liability of licensed establishment for over-serving their patrons. If the patrons involved in an accident, the establishment may become involved in litigation with potentially significant consequences. What does it mean for any commercial exposure? There's a duty on the commercial host to be mindful of the patrons who consume alcohol. The duty is owed not to just the patron, but to the public at large. And the duty comes from the fact that establishments are seeking to profit from the sale of alcohol when you know what alcohol does to people's bodies. So you can't knowingly be generating revenue and be ignorant to the fact that alcohol affects people in different ways, and can result in losses to the general public or to the patron himself or herself. So when is the duty met? The law requires the establishment to do what is appropriate in the circumstances and address the risks that an intoxicated patron poses to himself or to the public. The duty is usually met when the patron gets home safely. So I have a couple cases just on the next couple of slides, and I'll ask for some interaction on this one. So we'll read through them, and then I'll show of hands to say who thinks the defendant was guilty, the bar or the hotel was guilty in these cases. So the first one's a little older, from 1974, but Jordan House Limited versus Manow. And all these are case laws from White Law Twinning, as a law corporation that we use. They're the one that did our waiver. They're based in Vancouver with office in Calgary as well. So I thank them for the commercial host presentation that included this. So the patron became intoxicated and was ejected. I'm sure we've all seen somebody get ejected from a bar before. He was struck by a car while walking home on the highway. So he wasn't driving home, but he was walking, and he was struck by a car. How many people in here think that the bar was guilty? You are correct. The bar was guilty in this case because it failed to see that he got home safely, regardless of whether he was driving or not. So the next one was Fever versus Briggs. A patron was struck by a car while he and his group, which included 3 other people, and one of them happened to be his wife, who were not impaired, walking on the road after leaving the bar. So similar situation to the one above, but he left, he was drunk, his 3 other partners were sober. He got hit by a car. Was the bar guilty in this case? A couple of no's? No?
How many drinks did they serve him? That would be one of the questions.
He was intoxicated, well over the legal limit. Yeah.
Well, then whoever served him was responsible.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Guilty or not guilty?
They've done their due diligence by releasing him when people were capable of transporting him safely.
You are correct. So the comment in the front was they were not guilty. The bar was not guilty in this case because even though the patron was highly intoxicated, he was placed in the hands of 3 other people, including his wife. Whether she pushed him in front of the car or not, I have no idea. But who were responsible for him and who were not impaired. So he was the drunk one, but the bar did what it needed to do, in that it put him in the hands of capable, sober people to get him home. And he was hit by a car in that case. It does not fall on the bar. They did what they needed to do. If those 3 had been drunk and all of them were drunk, that's a different story. But there was enough sober people around this man. They should have helped him try to get home. It didn't fall on the bar. Just a couple more. So the review, Newfield versus Foster in 1999. So the patron was injured in a car accident after she drove with an intoxicated fellow patron. The pub grossly overserved 2 of the 4 members of the group. No member of the group was sober, and they were the last to leave. The bartender, did its best, took one of the set of car keys and called a taxi, but the group decided not to take the taxi that the bar called. Guilty or not guilty? A few answers. They were found guilty. The court found the pub should have asked for car keys from all members of the group and to ensure they actually got into the taxis once they left the pub. Remember, the duty of care rests when your patron who you've served alcohol gets home. So regardless of whether one of them decided to hand in his keys, they all should have handed in their keys, or the par should have insisted that they all get into a cab and not let them leave without it. Obviously, not being in the situation, who knows if they tried, but this was a legal court case, and that's the way it ended, so there is a duty of care to the public. And the last one I have is Salm versus Coyle. Intoxicated patron was driven home by a designated driver and in the company of a friend who was not intoxicated. After arriving home, the patron left in her father's car and injured somebody else. Guilty or not guilty? You're correct. So it's not guilty in this case. The bar did what it needed to do and ensured that the patron got home safely. What he or she decided to do after she got home really falls on that person and not the bar who served the alcohol. So again, just something to keep in mind. If you're hosting an event, they need to make sure that they get home safely. You are ultimately responsible for that. So just a comment on the link below. It was a recent Saskatchewan issue from 2017 where the Saskatchewan sues bars that serve drunk drivers who killed a family of 4. Obviously a very sad situation. Both parents and both kids were killed in an accident. Obviously very sad in terms of how it went down, but really illustrates the issues that are coming into Saskatchewan specifically. So SGI, who was here, sued the 2 bars. They were saying that the bars knew that the woman was drunk. She was 3 times over the legal limit, and no one prevented her from driving. Ultimately, someone has to be responsible in addition to herself, which I believe she's in jail for 10 years now, I think. No, she's not in jail. Was it 10 months? She got something small. Okay. So, I mean, even in an even worse situation that she's not, ultimately responsible, but this is where you as an event holder that's serving alcohol need to be aware. There's a legal obligation to make sure your patrons get home safe. It's the first time that SGI has filed such a claim, but I can tell you in Ontario and BC it's becoming the norm. They're going after bars or events that are hosting liquor events and making sure that responsibility lies on you. So by all means, have a good time, host a great event, but be aware that the issues may be in the background. And just a note on that as well, Canada Stats says that there was 683 police reported impaired driving incidents per 100,000 population in Saskatchewan in 2011. The Canadian average was 262. So it's obviously a significant issue in this province, one that you should be aware of. It's twice the amount that's in the rest of the country. So be aware that more people, if you're serving them alcohol, more people are getting in their car here than in any other province and driving home. And you need to be aware that that's taking place. So from an insurance point of view, I mean, obviously the personal side of you is completely different, but from an insurance point of view, you're protecting yourself from any claims or lawsuits. Okay, last thing I just want to talk about, just so we can stay on track for time and answer any questions, is really the look at safety. Safety protocols obviously have changed. Typical review of safety includes, perimeter reviews, metal detectors if it's a large community or large city organization, security guards maybe you have at the entrance to the event, security inside the event or the venue. Most people are smart serve trained from a bartender point of view. So that's pretty much what we've always done. But the reason why I said at the beginning that safety is the new fun is that you used to go to events and everybody would say, have a great time, have fun. Where now it's changing in a lot of cities to, please be safe. Be careful out there, make sure you're aware of your surroundings. And that's really, unfortunate that's the way we've headed, but something that everybody needs to be mindful of. And nobody can really say it doesn't happen in my town or my city, because it definitely happens in a lot more cities and towns these days. I don't need to go through all the shooting events that taken place, but you know what? There's local homegrown terrorists. There's obviously international terrorists. There's things that people should be aware of. And I'm sure everybody remembers the Vegas shooting, which I'll touch on in a minute. But Edmonton also had a terrorist attack a day prior to that during an Eskimos football game. So don't think it can't happen here. It can, and you need to be aware of it when you're designing your safety plans. So typical protocols, like I mentioned, are outlined above. Some new items to consider, expanding the perimeter outside of the 4 walls of the event or the venue. Just because there are people congregating outside your event doesn't mean you're not on the hook. Quick example I have would be that we insure the Formula One race in Montreal. Believe it or not, it is actually a BYOB event, so you can bring your own alcohol to it. There's 180,000 people that attend every day. So you can imagine the amount of the coolers and everything that need to attend that go into the space. So obviously, organizers have talked about, checking everybody's bags. Everything was well intentioned. But because of that, when you come off the subway to get onto the island where the racetrack is occurring, you stop in a group of about 10,000 people with unchecked bags in a long line that took about 40 minutes to get in. Obviously, as the insurance company, we had some serious concerns in that, any one of these coolers could have explosives or any issues in them, and you're literally stuck 20 wide, 10,000 deep, trying to get in. So that's where, if you don't think that the event's going to be on the hook because it didn't happen, in the Formula One, you'd be seriously questioning that. So really, just expand the walls of where everything happens. Find out where the true entrance to the place is. And does staff know what to do in an emergency? Make sure they're not just SmartServe trained for alcohol, but they know where all the risks lie, and really know how to get people out safely versus keeping them in. That is the new approach that we're taking. You can see in the two pictures that are on the slide, the one below is the actual fence from the Vegas shooting. You can see that it's structured in a way, I don't know if you can see it in the back, but it's structured in a way to keep people in, to protect them on the inside. But the issue happened when the shooter obviously attacked them and nobody can get out. So what we recommended was the fencing. What we recommend is obviously the fencing on the top right. It's even higher than the fence on the bottom, but it has 2 pins that can be easily pulled, and the fence can be pushed away in the event that you need to get people out. So just something to consider if you're reviewing risks in general. So just understand the overall risk. Just start planning in advance. Bring all parties to the plate early enough. Draft policies and procedures. Make sure you have weather-related contingencies. And bottom line, get the proper insurance. As Kevin mentioned before, we do more than just collect money and pay claims. We provide advice. We provide loss control. Price is obviously one factor of insurance, but coverage is really your key and going to help protect you along the way. So. And that is all I have. So appreciate we're getting closer to the time allotted, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. If not, like I said, Kevin and Susan are back there. We'll be happy to talk to you afterwards and discuss any concerns you might have. Any questions? You have one? Yeah.
With the marijuana regulations changing,
Yep.
how is that going to change the risk for municipalities?
The question was around marijuana and how that's going to change as it comes in July 1st. I would say from what we've spoken about and what we've discussed from the insurance circles that I've been involved in, is it'll be treated the same way as alcohol. If you're at an event that allows or sells dispensaries where they allow marijuana smoking to take place, it obviously can impair drivers just like alcohol would, and you'd be ultimately responsible for getting them home safely as you would if they were consuming alcohol. The same thing would go, if you're at work, you can't just go for a smoke break and a marijuana break. It would be considered the same as consuming alcohol in the middle of the day. So you have to treat it the same way. It is still a narcotic that affects your body. So we're from what we've seen to this point, we assume it'll follow the same legislation and regulations around alcohol. Okay.
We have time for your last question. It's got to be quick.
Okay. Just Tracy, town of Queensbury. Just wondering if do you provide coverage for ice fishing derbies, and should they be using waivers? And our service clubs have adequate insurance for those events, like say Lions or Kinsman clubs?
There'll be a couple parts to that question. I can speak on behalf of K&K, and maybe Kevin wants to touch base on the SUMA piece. But K&K does provide coverage for fishing derbies. Obviously, when you're out on the ice, we recommend waivers are in place. But it is something we provide regular fishing derby coverage as well as ice fishing derbies. So from our perspective, we have no concerns with it, as long as it meets minimum ice depths and has been checked before anybody goes out there. And obviously the proper waivers are in place. Maybe Kevin just wants to touch on that.
Yeah, just as far as who's covered, the groups and various things like that run events, we keep it very simple, almost black and white, just saying that if the town or the municipality is running the event, then that event can be covered under our insurance. If it's an independent group running it that has nothing to do with the town, they're just using your facilities, then they need to buy the special event insurance. So that's
Which
an
they
easy
could
way
also
of-
get through us. So,
Exactly, yeah.
yeah. Coverage is available. Okay. Thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it.
That's good. Thank you, Kevin, for your presentation, and we appreciate the time you've spent with us today. Also, thank you to our sponsor, SUMA, and thank you for all of you for joining us today. Remember, the presentations will be available on SUMA's YouTube channel later this month. We now have a 15-minute refreshment break sponsored by 13 Ways before moving into the second round of educational things. I just want to make sure that SUMA representatives back there, Kevin Madden and Susan Fiddick, are available for any questions that you might like to have. And if you're really tough trying to get somebody to answer that question, we've got Dean from our board over here, and I'm Al from the board. So anyway, thank you again.